I hope I can speak quite loudly. Can you hear me in the back? Great, I can see some nods. So again, my name is Céline Giertta. I work for Concord, Sweden, as an Advocacy and Policy Officer, specifically on migration. And Concord, Sweden is a platform for over 60 civil society organizations, and together we try to influence both Swedish politics and also European politics. And when it comes to the Agenda 2030, we use it a lot in our work. We can always refer to it as a commitment for national governments and the EU. Even though sometimes we have to remind politicians about this commitment. Is this my first slide? Yes. Okay. Let's see. I don't think so. Okay. Let's stay there. Anyway, there's maybe a microphone.
I'm working now.
No. Okay. Let's continue. Okay, I'm getting a little bit distracted, and I'm have to keep track of time. I'm a little bit behind schedule.
We were anyway, so good.
All right. Okay, so I'd like to give you first a little bit of a background, how the SDGs came about, and then I'd like to talk about where we are today, and then hopefully I can end up on a positive note. It's sometimes a little bit difficult. But if we look at these goals, it's not. Oh, let's get that. There are mainly two goals that specifically mention migration. It's the goal 10.7.
Okay, and is talking about to facilitate migration in a well-managed 8.8 that is talking a lot about migrant working rights, as we've heard before. However, IOM also tried to outline a few more goals that is dealing with migration. 8, and then we can find them in other places. And this might seem to be very few, considering the total amount of goals are 169. And I think that's important to question, because it's a really big issue today. But if we look at how the agenda came about, it was drafted before autumn of 2015 and adopted in September 2015. So basically before the big migration flows started. So in a way, it was probably lucky that it started at that time. Otherwise, we might have seen a more restricted framework. So let's go on. What does it actually mean to facilitate migration? I think it's a very good way of explaining it is that it's a political acknowledgement that policies that are restrictive doesn't really work. We have to facilitate migration because it's always going to be there. It's not something new that has happened throughout history. Can I try to use the slides again? It works fine. However, if we look to European policies, facilitating migration is not really what is happening. if we look at not this picture, but the second, no, okay, this is a big. At this picture, this is what we saw autumn 2015, refugees welcome. And then this basically happened. We started to build borders around Europe. So we've gone from refugees welcome to refugees go home. And the EU wants to prevent displacement to the EU, and it's basically convinced that it can do so by taking different measures. And we can see this change also not only in policies and in different countries, but in EU official documents. If we look at the discourse, okay, this is, sorry, let's just close the PowerPoint because it's not working in the correct way. So some of the wordings being used is that we have to combat irregular migration. It's not really a way of facilitating migration. I think that's a very strong word to talk about combating migration. We also see some other wordings that the EU should increase its leverage to persuade third countries to accept more immigrants. I think also using its leverage to persuade third countries is basically going back to some sort of colonialism. And then EU wants to promote its interest in third countries. So we're moving away from values to interests. Another wording being used is that we have to manage effective returns, and that is completely dehumanizing. We are less and less talking about human beings. We're starting to talk about effective management and not mention the people that are there. Again, we talk about effective control and surveillance of external borders. So there's been a securitizing shift in the migration policies. I also think it's ironic to prevent people from moving, because if you look at the EU itself, basically all people working within the EU has moved to Brussels from another place. And the MEPs, so the members of the European Parliament, have to commute between Brussels and Strasbourg every month. So they should be aware of the importance of mobility, but they're forgetting about it, it seems like. Another thing that we see is that the EU is now talking about the decreasing number of migrants arriving to Europe as a success, but at the same time forgetting that more people are dying at sea. So basically, the EU understands migration as a global issue or as a global problem, because that's how they're framing it. And the driver right now is to get rid of that global problem within its own borders. And the EU understands that migration cannot really go away, but it can stay away from Europe by placing it somewhere else. So this is the new European perspective. However, to adjust to global reality, the EU's internal interest is now being used in external policies and cooperation. This is what we call externalization. I think someone mentioned it here earlier. And again, I'll give you some examples of this. And if you haven't heard of these policies before, you can just raise a hand and ask me to specify further. So I'll start with giving an example of the European Trust Fund for Africa. Someone knows about it? Okay, one person. The European Trust Fund for Africa was set up during or after the Valletta summit that set the new migration agenda for
the EU. And the whole idea with the European Trust Fund is to address the root causes of migration in African countries. So the EU is giving funding to African countries to contain and prevent irregular migration, to fight human trafficking, and contributing to effective return and readmission, and capacity building of law enforcement and border management. So you see, the EU again is using its own interest, that is preventing migrants to arriving in Europe, but putting that responsibilities on other countries. And this funding is actually a type of development aid. And development aid is supposed to go to poverty reduction and sustainable development. But you cannot really say that that is working in this case. So also more and more funding is taken from the European budget to work against, well, more funding that is supposed to go to development aid is going to stemming migration. And this will, the last conclusions of the European Council in June stated that this trust fund, they will increase the funding to this trust fund. Some of the money also goes to vocational training and improved food security, but it's only a very small part of the funding. And then, secondly, we have the EUTurkey Statement. Some people know about that one. I think you do, though I only frame it differently. I see some nods. Sometimes it's called the EUTurkey Deal, and I am not going to call it that, because the EUTurkey Deal is actually a press release. Nothing is written down about it. And I don't know if you've ever heard of a bilateral or multilateral agreement that is not written down on paper when it's covering 6 billion euros on a period of 2 years. I think that's very interesting. A lot, yeah, yes. And the EUTurkey Statement is all about the migrants arriving to the Greek islands can be sent back to Turkey. And then Turkey can deal with these migrants. And now it's going to be extended so all European countries can send back migrants to Turkey. And then we have the Libyan EU Agreement. Someone is aware of this one? Yes. It's been reported quite heavily in the news. So the EU gives funding to Libya, to the Coast Guard. So the Coast Guard will pick up people from the ocean and bring them back to Libya and put them in detention centers. So they won't arrive in Europe. And in these detention centers, slavery has been reported, sexual abuse, gender-based violence, forced child marriage, and so on. And this is what the EU is giving money to. And then, let's see, the new proposal from the European Council is to set up something that they've called disembarkation platforms. The idea of this, are you aware of these disembarkation platforms? Yeah, great, I see some nods. The idea is basically that people that are, again, saved in the sea will be taken back to North Africa. So it's about in the Mediterranean area. And they will have to seek asylum in these countries. So if they're picked up in the territorial sea belonging to North Africa or international water, they will be sent to Africa. And even if it's an EU vessel that picks up these people, they will still be sent back to North Africa. This is being discussed. funding has not been decided on. Most countries in North Africa says they don't want this. But this is before funding has been decided. And if the EU provides more money, they might accept this idea. And the UNHCR and the IOM is supportive of this idea. So, let's see. Well, we can see, well, I'd like to say what Concord is doing on this matter. As I said, we're trying to influence Swedish and European policy. And now we are part of a multi-stakeholder platform at the EU level. And we're discussing with the Commission how to improve the SDGs in its work, though it's very, very limited. The EU is just basically writing a reflection paper on this, and that's all it will do. There were discussions if the EU should report to the high-level political forum, which is voluntary, and they decided not to. So not a lot of things will happen on the EU level. And I'm not very optimistic. Someone was before about finding a common European migration policy, because what we are seeing happening is not very positive. And then, as I said, I still like to end on a positive note. And this grim picture I might have given you, I think it can be changed. And because we do have a framework that we can use. And at least when I talk to the Swedish government, they are very aware of the Agenda 2030, and they implement it in its own policies. And other governments are too. So perhaps the EU will look further into this. And I think the starting point of the agenda is actually fantastic. It's about sustainability. So it's a long-term perspective on migration, which is definitely needed. And I think the whole idea that we need to facilitate migration says that we need to change policies. And it's a built-in logic that building walls in EU, in Turkey, in the EU, again, the EU, I guess there's a lot of walls, but also in the US, for example, it is not an intelligent way to deal with migration. People have always moved, and they will continue to move. And again, the agenda has a very clear rights-based approach, which is great. And I think we need to remind politicians about that all the time. And as the agenda says, we are not leaving anyone behind. That is the main kind of slogan. So I'm going to say it, leave no one behind. That's what we're going to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have some questions?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I very much appreciated you bringing out the various caveats that all these kind of good plans of the EU have, because they have to pretend they're doing something, but they're not always doing it properly, right? But about these regional disembarkation platforms, I like to think of them as platforms in the international bus station or something where people just get out and then ask for asylum. I had understood that people will also be able to apply for asylum in the EU countries. At least that was the initial idea. Whether this is going to happen or not is a different question. But do you think that if the EU or separate member states become more involved both with human resources, administrative, financial resources into operation of centers like this outside of the EU. Could that be the more sustainable solution where, you know, sort of a resettlement thing so they wouldn't have to get on the boats or pay smugglers, but that they would be able to apply for asylum outside of the EU, because currently it's basically not possible.
To answer the first question, yes, people will be able to seek asylum as well in the European Union. And the idea is to set up something called controlled centers. And there's financing for that in the new budget. But those people seeking asylum will have to be in Europe, which will basically be impossible. So that's the answer to that. And yes, the whole discourse about rescuing people at sea, I mean, it's kind of logic. We need to rescue more people. But I don't know if that's really going to happen with the disembarkation platforms. I mean, currently, the EU is also blaming NGOs rescuing people at sea because that is disturbing the politics. And I think that is also causing more people dying, basically. And placing the disembarkation platforms in another country so that less and less people can seek asylum in Europe is basically breaching the Asylum Convention. And since the disembarkation platforms will probably be based in countries as Egypt, you can really question if it will be safe there, because Egypt is constantly violating human rights. Yes. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have other questions?
Basically, I understood you said that in order to have sustainability, we need sustainable policies. Like, how do we approach the politicians, the decision makers? What are the most effective ways of putting in the policies in their heads so they would do it?
I think,
Tricky one.
well, some people earlier today have mentioned that Europe needs more workforce. So I think that's the way to go about it, trying to push forward that matter, because I think that could be a motivating factor. Though at the same time, we have to remember that we cannot only recruit the elite, we still have to help people, refugees that are fleeing from war. So, yeah, somehow pushing forward the whole working agenda, the need of skills. And then let's see if there are other things to do. Well, I mean, we do need legal pathways. We do. But when I talk to civil servants within the EU, there is no interest for that. But I think we still have to put forward that topic.